Darius Cole, a man whose life had been shaped by challenges most couldn't fathom, let out a deep sigh as he steered his sleek brand-new sedan through the winding streets of Hillcrest, an affluent neighborhood celebrated for its tranquility. It had been an exhausting day in court, a relentless series of hearings that tested his patience and resolve. But now, with the evening breeze slipping through the partially open window and the soothing strains of jazz filling the cabin, Darius felt a semblance of peace returning. His work as a judge often left him drained, but this drive home was his sanctuary, a space to decompress and reflect. Darius's journey to the bench had been anything but easy. Growing up in the heart of Brimview, a tough inner-city neighborhood, he had faced hurdles at every turn. Law school had been an unrelenting battle, and even as he climbed the ranks, he encountered prejudice from those who couldn't accept that someone like him could wield so much authority. Yet, he had persevered, driven by an unshakable belief that justice should be blind to race or background. His achievements were a testament to his resilience. Today, Darius was a respected figure in the legal system, a mentor to aspiring lawyers, and a symbol of possibility for young black men who saw their aspirations reflected in him. As he cruised past the stately homes of Hillcrest, he allowed himself to relax. A faint smile played on his lips as the soft leather seats cradled him. His life, though far from perfect, was good. The car, his latest indulgence, was more than just a vehicle. It was a symbol of all he had worked for, a tangible reminder of the obstacles he had overcome. The sun hung low on the horizon, bathing the neighborhood in hues of orange and pink. This was Darius's favorite time of day, a moment when the weight of his responsibilities seemed lighter. Just as he reached to turn up the volume on the jazz track, the tranquility was shattered. A flash of red and blue lights reflected in his rearview mirror, and his stomach dropped. Darius frowned, glancing at the police cruiser trailing him, its lights flashing insistently. Confusion overtook him. He was sure he hadn't been speeding. In fact, he'd been driving well under the limit, savoring the leisurely pace. But as his heartbeat quickened, a wave of unease washed over him. He'd heard too many stories about encounters like this, stories that rarely ended well. Reluctantly, Darius signaled and eased his car to the side of the road. The police cruiser followed closely, its lights casting harsh rhythmic flashes onto the quiet street. The serene atmosphere of Hillcrest was replaced by a suffocating tension. Darius gripped the steering wheel tightly, his knuckles white as the weight of apprehension settled over him. He reminded himself of who he was, a judge, a figure of authority. Surely this was just a misunderstanding. A sharp knock on his window startled him. Turning, Darius saw a tall, broad-shouldered officer standing outside, her expression cold and unreadable. Her badge gleamed under the streetlights. "License and registration," she barked, her tone clipped and devoid of courtesy. There was no greeting, no explanation, just a command. Darius's brow furrowed in confusion, but he complied, reaching for his documents from the glove compartment. He handed them to her, but she barely glanced at them before her sharp gaze returned to him, scrutinizing him in a way that made his skin crawl. "Step out of the car," she ordered, her voice firm and unyielding. Darius blinked, stunned. "Excuse me?" he asked, his voice calm but filled with disbelief. "I said step out of the car," she repeated, her tone even harder this time. Her hand hovered near the gun holstered at her side, and Darius felt the weight of the moment pressing down on him. This was no routine traffic stop. It was something much darker, and though his pulse quickened, he resolved to stay composed. "Officer," he began, his voice steady but cautious, "there must be some mistake. I'm Judge Darius Cole. This is my vehicle, and I live just a block away." The officer's expression didn't change. Her eyes, cold and distrustful, locked onto his. "Step out of the vehicle, Judge," she repeated, her voice sharper now, "or we're going to have a problem." Darius's heart sank. His title, his position, meant nothing in this moment. To her, he was just another black man driving a nice car. Darius's stomach churned. He had expected her demeanor to shift upon hearing his title. After all, he had presided over numerous cases in this very district. Yet there was no recognition, no acknowledgement, no respect. His title felt meaningless in her eyes. Suppressing the frustration welling within him, he reached for the door handle. He opened the door slowly, deliberately, and stepped out, his heart pounding as he moved. The cool evening air felt oppressive now, carrying the weight of suspicion and fear. Standing beside his car, Darius felt Officer Torres's sharp gaze upon him. She circled him like a predator sizing up its prey. "We've had reports of stolen vehicles in the area," she said, her eyes darting between Darius and his sleek sedan. "This car matches the description." Darius's jaw tightened. "This is my vehicle. I purchased it brand new from the dealership a few days ago. If you run the plates, you'll see it's registered to me." Her expression remained unchanged, her suspicion unwavering. "Hands on the hood," she commanded curtly. "Is this really necessary?" Darius asked, his voice low, strained with disbelief. "Hands on the hood?" Torres snapped, stepping closer, her tone brooking no argument. Grinding his teeth, Darius complied, placing his hands on the smooth surface of the hood. The cool metal bit into his palms, but it was nothing compared to the sting of humiliation spreading through his chest. He caught movement out of the corner of his eye, neighbors peering out from behind their curtains, their silhouettes barely visible in the dim light. Their curiosity and judgment added another layer to the indignity of the moment. Torres began patting him down, her hands brisk and unyielding as though she had already rendered her verdict. "This vehicle matches the description of one reported stolen last week," she muttered, her tone devoid of empathy. "I've already explained," Darius said, his voice taut with barely restrained anger. "This car is mine." She didn't seem to hear him, or didn't care. To her, he was just another suspect. Another black man in a nice car. As her hand moved toward her handcuffs, Darius knew he had to act. His heart thudded in his chest, but his mind remained sharp. He wasn't going to let this escalate without challenging it. "Before you make a decision you'll regret," he said, his tone steady and authoritative. "I suggest you call your superior officer." Torres froze, her hand hovering above the cuffs. For the first time, a flicker of doubt crossed her face. Darius met her gaze, unflinching. "Do your job properly, officer," he continued. "Run the plates and call your captain." The tension between them was almost tangible, hanging thick in the chilly night air. Finally, with a muttered curse under her breath, Torres reached for her radio. She fumbled with it, her previously rigid demeanor now showing cracks of uncertainty. As she relayed the information over the radio, Darius stood motionless, his hands still pressed against the hood of his car. The serene evening had transformed into a tense standoff, charged with an undercurrent of something far more insidious. He could feel the weight of his neighbors' stares on his back, their gazes burning with curiosity, confusion, or quiet judgment. This wasn't just a routine traffic stop. It was a spectacle. Darius's thoughts churned as he waited. He had fought too hard and sacrificed too much to reach this point in his life, only to be reduced to a suspect on the side of the road in his own neighborhood. As Officer Torres continued speaking into her radio, the damage had already been done. The weight of injustice settled over him, a heavy, suffocating presence that had become all too familiar over the years. That truth hit Darius like a punch to the gut, heavier than the humiliation of being publicly singled out. The radio crackled again, breaking the oppressive silence. Torres stepped back slightly, listening intently to the garbled voice on the other end. Her face flickered between impatience and uncertainty, and for a moment, Darius thought he saw something else. Fear. Not fear of him, but fear of the consequences of her actions. She was beginning to understand the magnitude of what was unfolding, though the weight of her assumptions still hung in the air between them. Darius's thoughts turned to his family, his wife, Tessa, and their two children, Marcus and Lila. He thought of the conversations he'd had with Marcus about how to handle moments like this, how to stay calm, to de-escalate, and to survive encounters with law enforcement that too often turned dangerous for people who looked like them. He had hoped that his success would stand as proof for his son that a black man could rise above prejudice, that hard work and dignity could overcome bias. But standing here, under the harsh spotlight of racial profiling, Darius understood more deeply than ever just how pervasive that bias was. Marcus had once asked him, "Dad, does it ever get better? Do people ever stop seeing us like this?" Darius had hesitated before answering, not wanting to crush his son's optimism with the weight of reality. He had told Marcus to stay strong, to keep his head high, and to never let anyone strip him of his worth. But now, feeling the dignity he had fought so hard to protect being stripped away, Darius wondered if his answer had been enough. The seconds dragged on, each one heavier than the last. When the radio finally crackled again, Officer Torres visibly tensed. Darius couldn't make out the words, but he didn't need to. Her face said it all. She had made a mistake, a colossal one, and now had to grapple with the fallout. Slowly, Darius lowered his hands from the car, his movements deliberate. He turned to face her, his gaze steady, his voice low but firm. "Well?" he asked, every word carefully measured. "What now, officer?" For a moment Torres didn't respond. Her expression was a blend of embarrassment and stubborn defiance. The hand that had been hovering near her radio fell to her side, and she took a step back, exhaling sharply as if trying to regain control of the situation. But it was clear she was rattled. The arrogance she had displayed earlier was gone, replaced by the realization that she had overstepped her authority in a way that couldn't be undone. She began, stumbling over her words. "There seems to have been a misunderstanding." Darius raised an eyebrow, his anger bubbling just beneath the surface. "A misunderstanding?" he echoed, his tone cutting through the air like a blade. Torres shifted uncomfortably, avoiding his piercing gaze. I thought—" "You thought what?" Darius interrupted, his voice sharp but controlled. "That I stole this car? That I'm just some criminal driving through a neighborhood I don't belong in?" He stepped closer, his tall frame casting a shadow over her, though his movements were slow and deliberate. "Tell me, officer," he continued, his tone unyielding. "What exactly went through your mind when you decided to pull me over? Did you think my skin color told you everything you needed to know?" Torres looked down, her face flushed with shame, but she didn't respond. Darius's words hung in the air, a pointed indictment of the assumptions that had led to this moment. The silence stretched, thick with tension. Darius's heart pounded, but he held his ground. This wasn't just about him, it was about something far larger. This was about the countless moments of prejudice that had gone unchallenged, about ensuring his children wouldn't have to endure the same indignities he faced tonight. Finally, Torres looked up, her voice barely above a whisper. I made a mistake." "Yes," Darius said, his voice steady but hard. "You did, and now you'll have to answer for it." How does a judge, a person entrusted with upholding the law, get mistaken for a criminal in his own neighborhood? Darius Cole's voice was steady but filled with controlled anger as he stared at Officer Torres. Her face flushed a deep red, but she didn't respond. There was no explanation that could justify her actions. The weight of her own prejudice hung over her like a storm cloud, and she seemed to feel its oppressive pull. The silence stretched unbearably, thick with tension, until the low hum of an approaching engine broke the stillness. A second police cruiser pulled up, and Darius immediately recognized the man stepping out. Captain Mason, a veteran officer with streaks of gray in his hair and a demeanor hardened by years of navigating the politics of law enforcement, walked toward them with brisk determination. His face was set in a grim expression as he surveyed the scene. "Judge Cole," Captain Mason called out, his voice a mix of urgency and regret as he closed the distance. "I'm so sorry about this. We got the call, and, well, it looks like there's been a serious mistake." Darius crossed his arms, his jaw tight. "A mistake," he repeated bitterly. "That's the word of the night, isn't it?" Mason stopped a few feet from him, glancing briefly at Officer Torres, who stood stiffly to the side, her face now pale with shame. Letting out a weary sigh, the captain turned back to Darius. "I can't tell you how sorry I am," Mason said. "This is unacceptable, Judge Cole." Darius's anger simmered beneath the surface, but his voice remained steady. "Sorry won't undo what's already been done, Captain. I was humiliated in front of my neighbors. My character, my integrity, everything I've worked for was reduced to nothing in minutes. So, what now? What are you going to do about it?" Mason rubbed a hand over his face, clearly uncomfortable. "We'll handle this internally, Judge. I'll make sure Officer Torres faces the necessary consequences. This isn't something we take lightly." Darius studied Mason's face, his sharp eyes searching for any sign of genuine accountability. He had seen this too many times before. Officers reprimanded in private while the system that allowed such blatant prejudice continued unchecked. A quiet behind-the-scenes resolution wasn't enough. This wasn't just about him, and he knew it. "I need more than an internal review, Captain," Darius said firmly. "I want this addressed publicly. The community needs to see that racial profiling has consequences. I want transparency, and I want real action." Mason hesitated, glancing again at Taurus, who seemed to shrink under Darius's pointed words. "Judge Cole, I understand your frustration, but—" "No, Captain," Darius interrupted, his tone unyielding. "You don't understand, not really. You've never had to live with this, but I have, and so has every other black man and woman in this community. If we don't make this right, if we don't hold people accountable, this will keep happening." The captain swallowed hard, then nodded slowly. "You're right," he admitted, his voice quieter now. "You're absolutely right." Darius exhaled, the tension in his chest loosening just slightly. "Then do something about it," he said simply. Mason glanced back at Taurus one last time before turning to Darius. "I will, Judge. I promise you I will." But promises like this weren't new to Darius. He had heard them before, seen them fall flat. As he stood there, watching Mason attempt to navigate the fallout, he knew this moment wasn't the end. It was only the beginning of a much larger fight. A fight not just for his own dignity, but for the dignity of every person who had ever been wrongly judged because of their skin color. The weight of that truth settled heavily on him as the night deepened. Darius turned back toward his car, his mind already racing with the next steps. This wasn't just a battle for himself. It was for his family, his community, and anyone who had ever been forced to carry the burden of systemic bias. And as he slid into the driver's seat, the quiet determination in his chest burned brighter than the anger that had initially fueled him. This fight was far from over. Darius Cole drove home in silence, the soft hum of his car the only sound accompanying him. The once lively jazz that had filled the cabin earlier was gone, replaced by the oppressive weight of the evening's events. The streets of Ashton Heights, usually a source of comfort and familiarity, now felt foreign and unwelcoming. It wasn't the first time Darius had faced discrimination, but this encounter had cut deeper. Maybe it was the setting, his own neighborhood, where he was supposed to feel safe. Or maybe it was the bitter reminder that no matter how much he had achieved, some would always see him as less. When he pulled into the driveway, the large maple tree in the front yard cast long shadows over the manicured lawn. Darius stayed in the driver's seat, gripping the steering wheel tightly. His heart still raced, not from fear, but from a simmering rage he had spent years learning to suppress. He had poured that anger into his work, into his pursuit of justice, but tonight it was harder to control. The porch light flickered on, and through the window, Darius could see his wife, Tessa, moving about the house. She was likely setting the table for dinner, unaware of what had just transpired. Tessa had always been his anchor, steady, strong, and endlessly understanding. But even with her support, there were things Darius had never fully shared. How could he explain the constant vigilance, the knowledge that at any moment his skin color could invite suspicion, hostility, or worse? Finally, Darius opened the car door, stepping out into the cool evening air. He stood for a moment, gazing at the two-story house before him. It was a beautiful home, with a neatly trimmed lawn and large windows that let in sunlight during the day. It was everything he had dreamed of as a child growing up in a cramped apartment in the city. But tonight, it felt hollow, a facade masking the inescapable burden of racial profiling. As he walked to the front door, each step felt heavier than the last. Just as he reached for the doorknob, the door swung open. Tessa stood there, her face lighting up at the sight of him. "Hey, love," she said warmly. "Dinner's almost ready. How was your day?" Darius hesitated, forcing a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "It was long," he replied, stepping inside. The familiar scent of her cooking filled the air, usually a source of comfort, but tonight it did little to ease his mind. "I'll be right in," he added. "I just need a minute." Tessa's smile faded as she studied his face. She knew him too well, could sense when something was wrong. "Darius, what happened?" He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I got pulled over." Her brow furrowed. "Pulled over? For what?" "Racial profiling," he said bluntly, the words bitter on his tongue. "I was driving home, and an officer assumed I'd stolen my own car." Tessa's expression shifted instantly from confusion to anger. "Are you serious? Here, in this neighborhood, who was it? What did they say?" Officer Torres, he replied, walking past her into the kitchen. She didn't say much, just treated me like a criminal until her captain showed up and realized who I was. Tessa followed him, her eyes blazing with indignation. Darius, this is unacceptable. You're a judge, one of the most respected people in this community. How dare they? It doesn't matter, Darius interrupted, his voice low but firm. None of that matters when they see my skin first. Tessa fell silent, the weight of his words sinking in. She knew this reality too well. Though their lives were comfortable, their success hard-earned, they could never fully escape the harshness of racial prejudice. Tessa had faced her own struggles in the corporate world, where her intelligence and professionalism were often questioned or dismissed because of her race. "What are you going to do about it?" she asked softly. Her voice steady despite the anger in her eyes. Darius leaned against the counter, the tension in his chest refusing to loosen. "I don't know yet," he admitted, "but I can't let this go. Not this time." Tessa's voice softened, though her determination remained clear. "Whatever you decide, Darius, you know I'm with you," she said, placing a reassuring hand on his arm. Darius leaned against the kitchen counter, gripping its edge as if it might steady the storm of thoughts swirling in his mind. He stared at the floor, his voice low. "I don't know yet," he admitted. "Captain Mason said they'd handle it internally, but that's not enough. This can't keep happening. Not to me, not to anyone." "You're right," Tessa agreed. "It can't. But remember, you're not alone in this." He nodded, grateful for her unwavering support, but the weight of his next move still pressed heavily on him. He had always been a man of action, someone who believed in working within the system to bring about change. But tonight had shaken his faith in that very system. The same system he had dedicated his life to defending had turned its back on him, subjecting him to the injustice he had fought so hard to eradicate. Later that evening, after dinner and after Marcus and Lila were tucked into bed, Darius retreated to his study. The soft glow of the desk lamp illuminated the room, casting warm light on the shelves lined with legal books and framed certificates. They were testaments to his years of dedication, but tonight they felt like hollow symbols. Sitting at his desk, he opened his laptop. His fingers moved swiftly over the keys as he began drafting an official complaint against Officer Torres. Yet, as he typed, a nagging thought crept in. Would this be enough? Would filing a formal complaint lead to meaningful change, or would it just become another case buried in the endless shuffle of bureaucracy? He paused, his hands hovering over the keyboard, his suppressed anger boiling to the surface. This wasn't just about him. It was about every black man and woman who had been treated as less, seen as suspicious or dangerous because of the color of their skin. He couldn't let this go. He wouldn't let it end here. Renewed determination filled him as Darius opened a new document. This time, he began drafting a letter to the local news outlets. He outlined what had happened in detail, calling for a public conversation about racial profiling and its devastating impact on their community. Quiet battles fought behind closed doors were no longer enough. If the system wasn't willing to change from within, he would force it to change by exposing the truth. He would ensure that everyone, especially his neighbors who had watched him humiliated from behind their curtains, understood the reality of what had transpired. When he clicked save, Darius leaned back in his chair, exhaling deeply. He knew this was only the beginning. Protecting himself wasn't enough. He had a responsibility to use his platform and his position to speak for those who couldn't. The silence of the house wrapped around him as he sat there, the weight of the night still heavy on his shoulders. But now it was balanced by a sense of purpose. This was his fight, but it was also a battle that transcended him. He stood on the front lines of a generational struggle, and he wasn't about to back down. Rising from his chair, Darius turned off the laptop and glanced out the window at the quiet street beyond. He thought of the neighbors who had peeked out at him, witnessing his humiliation. Soon, they would know the full story. And once they did, he would make sure they couldn't look away. As he headed to bed, the anger still simmered just beneath the surface, but it was tempered by clarity. Tomorrow, he would act, not just for himself, but for everyone who had ever been wronged by a system that saw guilt before innocence. This time, the community would have no choice but to confront the truth. Darius awoke early the next morning, his mind already buzzing with the gravity of what lay ahead. The sunlight filtering through the bedroom curtains felt sharper, as if it illuminated not just his surroundings but his intentions. He had spent the night reflecting, planning, and preparing. Now it was time to follow through. Downstairs, Tessa was already in the kitchen, her light footsteps echoing as she prepared breakfast for Marcus and Lila. The comforting aroma of freshly brewed coffee filled the house, but Darius's focus was elsewhere. Today wasn't just another day, it was the beginning of something much larger than himself. Darius Cole sat in quiet reflection, his breakfast untouched. His appetite had vanished, replaced by the weight of what lay ahead. Today felt different. A turning point not just for himself, but for something far greater. This wasn't about clearing his name or seeking personal vindication. It was about exposing a reality that too many in his community had been forced to endure for far too long. As he buttoned his crisp white shirt and adjusted his dark slacks, Darius caught his reflection in the mirror. The man staring back at him wasn't just a judge confined to the order and rules of the courtroom. Today, he was an advocate, a voice for the silenced. He had spent years working within the system, believing he could change it from the inside, but last night had shattered that illusion. The system itself was broken, and it was time to confront it head-on. Downstairs, Tessa was bustling in the kitchen, pouring coffee into a mug. The moment she saw him descending the stairs, her sharp eyes caught the determined expression on his face. "You're leaving early," she said, her tone gentle but laced with curiosity. Darius nodded, grabbing his briefcase from the hallway. "There's something I need to handle," he said simply. Tessa set the coffee pot down and walked over, standing in front of him. "You're going through with it, aren't you? The press? The public statement?" Meeting her gaze, Darius didn't waver. "I have to, Tessa. This isn't just about me anymore. It's about all of us. If I don't speak up, who will?" She sighed, her hand resting lightly on his arm. "I know," she said softly. "Just be careful. You know how quickly these things can spiral." Darius placed his hand over hers, squeezing gently. "I will, but staying quiet isn't an option anymore." Tessa nodded, her lips pressing into a thin line. She understood the risk, as did Darius. Going public with something like this, especially in a town like Hillcrest, could provoke backlash, resentment, and even danger. But silence would only allow the cycle of injustice to continue. Darius leaned forward, pressing a kiss to her forehead before stepping out the door. The cool morning air hit him as he walked to his car, but instead of chilling him, it sharpened his focus. His first stop was the courthouse. He needed to gather all the details on Officer Torres's file and compile the evidence he would need to substantiate his claims. After that, he planned to confront Captain Mason again, this time with a formal demand for accountability. As Darius drove, his thoughts turned to the countless others who had found themselves in his position but lacked the platform or resources to fight back. How many people of color had been wrongly accused, humiliated, or worse, with no one to hear their side of the story? He was fortunate in some ways. His title afforded him a level of credibility and protection that others might not have. But that privilege came with responsibility, and Darius felt it deeply. By the time he pulled into the courthouse parking lot, his plan was fully formed. He had already contacted a few local journalists he trusted, people he had worked with in past cases who had shown an interest in issues of justice and racial inequality. They were eager to hear his story and give it the platform it deserved. Darius braced himself for the fallout that would inevitably come. He knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but he also knew he couldn't back down. As he walked into the courthouse, the familiar environment offered little comfort. The polished marble floors, the echo of hurried footsteps, the low hum of conversations between attorneys and clients, all of it felt distant. It was as if he were moving through a space that no longer fit him. Today, Darius wasn't just a judge. He was something bigger, something more. Entering his chambers, he placed his briefcase on the cluttered wooden desk. Case files, legal briefs, and reminders of the work he normally prioritized sat untouched. Today, that work could wait. This was more important. He reached for the phone on his desk and began dialing Captain Mason's number. His finger hovered over the final digit for a moment, as if steadying himself, before pressing it. The line rang twice before the captain answered, his voice gruff but professional. "Mason here." "Captain, it's Darius Cole," he said, his voice calm but firm. The next conversation would set the tone for what was to come, and Darius was ready. This wasn't just about a single traffic stop. It was about exposing the truth, demanding accountability, and igniting change in a broken system. Darius Cole steadied his voice, measured but firm, as he spoke into the phone. "Captain Mason, I want to discuss what happened last night." There was a pause on the other end before Mason replied, his tone cautious. "I figured you'd call, Judge. I've already started looking into it. I've spoken with Officer Torres, and we're conducting an internal review." "That's not enough," Darius interrupted, his voice harder now. "This needs to go public. I want a full, transparent investigation. The community has a right to know what happened. They need to see that racial profiling isn't tolerated here." Mason sighed audibly, his discomfort evident. "I understand your frustration, Judge, but going public with this, it could create a media storm." "Is that really what you want?" Darius's grip on the phone tightened. "What I want," he said firmly, "is for the truth to come out. If that creates a media storm, so be it. People need to know that this kind of behavior has consequences, and they need to see that law enforcement is willing to hold itself accountable." Another pause followed. When Mason spoke again, his voice was lower, resigned. "All right, we'll do it your way. I'll set up a press meeting. But Judge Cole, you better be prepared for the fallout. This won't be easy." "I'm prepared," Darius replied steadily. "I've been dealing with this my whole life." After hanging up, Darius leaned back in his chair, a complex mixture of satisfaction and unease washing over him. He had forced Mason's hand, ensuring that the incident would not be buried in bureaucratic silence. Soon, not just the town but people far beyond Hillcrest would know the truth. But as the minutes ticked by, doubts crept in. What if the backlash is worse than I expect? What if this only makes things harder for my family? He shook his head, dispelling the thoughts. He knew why he was doing this. It wasn't just for himself. It was for Marcus, for Lila, and for every person of color who had ever felt the sting of injustice. He couldn't back down. Not now. Later that afternoon, Darius met with the journalists he had reached out to earlier. They gathered in a small conference room at the courthouse, their pens and recorders poised. Darius stood at the head of the table, his presence commanding, though a part of him felt exposed. This was unfamiliar territory, and he was acutely aware that his reputation and career were on the line. "Thank you all for coming," Darius began, his voice clear and confident. "I've asked you here because something happened last night that cannot go unaddressed. I was racially profiled by a police officer in my own neighborhood. Despite being a judge, despite the position I hold, I was treated as a suspect, solely because of the color of my skin." The room went silent. Every reporter's gaze was fixed on him, their pens scratching against paper or fingers adjusting microphones as they absorbed his words. Darius continued, recounting the events of the previous night in vivid detail. He laid bare the humiliation, the anger, and the injustice he had endured. He didn't sugarcoat the experience, nor did he downplay its significance. "I'm not sharing this for sympathy," he said, his voice firm and rising with conviction. "I'm sharing this because this is not an isolated incident. This is part of a larger systemic problem that affects people of color every day. It needs to stop. I'm calling for a full investigation into Officer Torres's actions, and I'm demanding that our police department implement better training to ensure this doesn't happen again." As he spoke, Darius felt the weight of the moment pressing down on him. This wasn't about making headlines or becoming the center of attention. This was about sparking change, holding the system accountable, and ensuring that no one else would have to experience what he had. The reporters began asking questions, probing deeper into the story. Darius answered each one with calm precision, leaving no detail unchecked. He was honest about his anger, his disappointment in the system, and his determination to fight for justice. By the end of the meeting, it was clear that his story would make waves, and that's exactly what Darius wanted. The community needed to see this. They needed to understand that silence only allowed injustice to thrive. As the reporters filed out of the room, Darius sat for a moment, letting the gravity of the day sink in. The road ahead would be difficult, but he was ready for the fight. If his voice could spark even the smallest change, then every risk would be worth it. When Darius Cole left the courthouse that afternoon, the air seemed different. The quiet town of Hillcrest was about to become the center of a growing storm, and he knew it. The truth had been unveiled, and while it was only the beginning, Darius was ready for what lay ahead. Real change never came without resistance. As he drove home, the streets of his neighborhood came into view, but they no longer felt like the safe haven they once were. Darius was stepping into a fight for justice, not just for himself, but for everyone who had ever been unfairly judged. This time, the world was watching. In the days following Darius's public statement, Hillcrest was anything but quiet. What had once been a peaceful, insulated community had become the epicenter of a heated debate. News of the incident spread faster than he'd anticipated. Social media erupted with posts, comments, and debates. Local news channels ran segments about the story, sparking conversations that reached far beyond the town's borders. Darius had expected resistance, but the sheer intensity of it was staggering. For every person who stood in solidarity with him, there seemed to be another who pushed back, loud, defensive, and resistant to change. Some of Hillcrest's more conservative residents began circulating alternative narratives. Distorted versions of the events painted Darius as a man overreacting, playing the race card, or trying to stir up unnecessary conflict. Others claimed Officer Torres had simply been doing her job and accused Darius of using his position to demand special treatment. His phone buzzed constantly with messages, some offering support and encouragement, others hostile and threatening. Anonymous emails trickled in, warning him to back off or accusing him of trying to ruin a good officer's career. Yet, amid the chaos, Darius held his ground. He had prepared for this moment, knowing that those who benefited from the status quo would fight to maintain it. Change was never easy and disruption was rarely welcomed. One evening, just days after the story broke, the weight of it all seeped into Darius's home. He sat at the dinner table with Tessa and their 2 children, Marcus and Lila. The air was thick with unspoken tension. Marcus, their 12-year-old son, was unusually quiet, pushing food around on his plate without eating. Lila, only 8 years old, seemed blissfully unaware of the storm brewing outside their walls, humming softly as she colored. Tessa tried to maintain a sense of normalcy, but Darius could see the concern etched into her face. Hillcrest had been their home for years, but now it felt like a battlefield. "What's wrong, Marcus?" Darius asked gently, breaking the silence. Marcus looked up hesitantly, his brow furrowed. "Some kids at school," he began, his voice barely a whisper. "They said things about you." Darius's chest tightened. He had braced himself for this, but wasn't prepared for the sting of hearing it from his son. "What did they say?" he asked. Marcus hesitated, then spoke softly. "They said you're making everything about race. That you're just trying to get that officer in trouble for no reason." Darius exhaled slowly, setting down his fork. He had heard similar accusations from strangers, but hearing it repeated through the lens of his child's experience cut deeper than he'd expected. "Marcus," he said, his voice calm but firm, "what happened wasn't just about me. It's about something much bigger. Do you understand that?" His son nodded, though confusion lingered in his eyes. "Yeah, but it's hard. They keep saying you're just doing it for attention." Before Darius could respond, Tessa reached over and rested a hand on Marcus's shoulder. "Your dad is standing up for something important," she said gently. "Something a lot of people don't understand, but that doesn't mean he's wrong." Darius looked at his son, searching for the right words. "Sometimes doing the right thing means facing criticism," he said. "It's not easy, and people will try to twist the truth because it makes them uncomfortable. But that doesn't change what's right." Marcus looked down at his plate, absorbing his father's words. "I get it," he said quietly, "but it still sucks." "It does," Darius agreed, his voice softening. "But standing up for what's right isn't always easy. It's worth it, though, not just for us, but for everyone who deserves to be treated fairly." The conversation lingered in Darius's mind long after the plates were cleared and the house fell silent. He knew the fight ahead would test not only him, but his family. The backlash from Hillcrest and beyond was fierce, and the division it revealed in the community was unsettling. But as he sat in his study that night, looking out at the quiet street beyond, Darius reminded himself why he had taken this stand. It wasn't just for him. It was for Marcus, for Lila, and for every child who deserved to grow up in a world that judged them by their character, not the color of their skin. The storm was far from over, but Darius was ready to weather it. This was a fight worth fighting. Marcus looked down at his plate, the weight of his father's words sinking in. Across the table, Lila, still too young to fully grasp the situation, remained blissfully focused on her drawing. Darius's gaze shifted to Tessa, who met his eyes with unspoken concern. The worry etched on her face mirrored his own. This wasn't just about a traffic stop anymore. It was about their entire family and the ripples now spreading through their lives. The next morning, Darius returned to the courthouse. The building, once a place of comfort and familiarity, now felt different. The tension in the air was palpable. Colleagues who had once greeted him warmly now avoided eye contact or spoke in hushed tones as he passed. Conversations seemed to stop abruptly when he walked by. Change always made people uneasy, and though Darius had expected this, it didn't make it any easier to bear. As he headed toward his chambers, Judge Franklin, a senior colleague known for his conservative views, called out to him. "Cole," Franklin said, his tone low. "Can I have a word?" Darius nodded, though he already knew the direction this conversation would take. The two men stepped into an empty conference room and Franklin closed the door behind them. "I've been hearing a lot about what's going on," Franklin began, his voice careful, almost diplomatic. "This situation with the police, it's really stirring things up." Darius remained silent, waiting for him to continue. "I'm not saying what happened to you wasn't wrong," Franklin went on. "But going to the press like that, you're a judge, Cole. We're held to a higher standard. We have to maintain a certain level of decorum, especially in a town like Hillcrest. You know how sensitive things can get." Darius's jaw tightened, but he kept his voice calm. "And what would you have me do, Franklin? Stay silent? Let them sweep it under the rug? I've spent my whole career fighting for justice, and now, when I'm the one being wronged, I'm supposed to pretend it didn't happen?" Franklin sighed, rubbing his temple. "I get that you're upset, but you have to think about the long-term consequences. This kind of publicity, it could affect your career, your reputation. People don't like it when judges get involved in political issues." "This isn't a political issue," Darius shot back, his voice firm. "This is about basic human rights. It's about justice. And if I can't speak up for that, then what's the point of any of this?" Franklin stared at him for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Finally he nodded, though his posture remained guarded. "Just be careful, Cole. You've worked too hard to throw it all away over one incident." "One incident?" Darius repeated, disbelief clear in his tone. "This isn't just one incident, Franklin. It's part of a much bigger problem. And if we don't stand up to it, nothing will ever change." Franklin didn't reply. The silence stretched between them, heavy and uncomfortable. Finally, Darius turned and left the room, his frustration simmering beneath the surface. He'd expected this kind of pushback, but was still stung by it. People like Franklin, who benefited from the system as it was, would never fully understand the stakes. Later that afternoon, Darius met with Captain Mason once more. The atmosphere this time was different. Mason looked tired, worn down by the mounting media attention and the growing pressure from both sides of the issue. "Judge Cole," Mason greeted him, his voice subdued as Darius stepped into his office. "Captain Mason," Darius replied, taking a seat across from him. The exhaustion was evident in the captain's posture and tone. He looked like a man caught in the middle of a storm, trying to find a way to calm the chaos. This conversation would be pivotal. It took, and Darius was ready to ensure it ended with real steps toward accountability and change. Captain Mason stood as he walked in, motioning him toward a chair. "I've arranged for a press conference tomorrow," Mason began, his tone measured. "Officer Torres will be present, along with a representative from the mayor's office. We'll make a public statement addressing the situation and outlining the steps we're taking to prevent this from happening again." Darius nodded, sensing the reluctance behind Mason's words. "Good, that's a start." Mason sighed, leaning back in his chair. "You know this isn't easy for anyone involved, right? Officer Torres, she's a good cop. She made a mistake, but she's not the villain here." Darius's gaze hardened, his voice steady but resolute. She may not be a villain, Captain, but she represents a system that is deeply flawed. A system that sees people like me as suspects first, citizens second. That's the real issue here. Mason ran a hand through his graying hair, his expression weary. I know, he said quietly. Believe me, I do. But change doesn't happen overnight. No, Darius agreed, his tone firm. It doesn't. But it has to start somewhere. And it starts here. The next day, the press conference was held in the Hillcrest Town Hall. Cameras flashed and reporters crowded into the room, their eyes fixed on the small stage where Captain Mason stood, flanked by Officer Torres and the mayor's representative. The air was thick with anticipation. Mason addressed the room first, acknowledging the incident and outlining the department's plans for additional training on racial sensitivity and de-escalation techniques. His voice was steady, but the weight of the moment was evident in his demeanor. Officer Torres stood to his side, her face pale and unreadable, as if bracing herself for the inevitable scrutiny. When it was Darius's turn, he stepped up to the podium. The weight of every eye in the room fell on him, but he stood tall, his voice steady as he began. This is not about one officer, Darius said, his words deliberate and clear. This is about a system that has failed too many times. A system that assumes guilt based on race, that profiles and discriminates without accountability. He paused, letting his words resonate with the room. Last week, I was treated like a criminal in my own neighborhood simply because of the color of my skin. That is unacceptable. The room was silent, every reporter hanging on his words. I'm here today not just for myself, but for every person who has ever been judged unfairly. For every black man and woman who has been pulled over, harassed, or worse, without cause. This has to stop, and it stops here, with this police department, in this community. The weight of his message lingered in the air as Darius stepped back from the podium. The reporters began their questions, but for a moment, the room was still, as if the gravity of his words had left everyone momentarily speechless. Change was never easy, and Darius knew this was just the beginning. But it was a first step, a necessary one. In the weeks that followed, Hillcrest was still buzzing with the aftershocks of the press conference. What had started as a personal ordeal for Darius had grown into a larger movement, a fight for justice, equality, and accountability in a system that had failed so many. The press conference had been a pivotal moment, but Darius understood that real change wouldn't come from a single speech or a single event. It required sustained effort, persistence, and the courage to keep pushing forward, even when the path ahead felt insurmountable. Darius spent the following weeks meeting with community leaders, activists, and even members of law enforcement. His goal was to bridge the gap between the people and the institutions meant to serve them. It wasn't easy. Trust, eroded over years of neglect, couldn't be rebuilt overnight. But something remarkable was happening. People were starting to listen. The town was waking up to the realities Darius had spoken about, and conversations about race, justice, and equality were unfolding in places where silence had once prevailed. The local news continued to cover the story, and soon it gained national attention. Darius's case struck a chord with communities across the country, resonating with people who had faced similar injustices. Messages of support poured in, letters, emails, and social media posts from individuals thanking him for his courage and sharing their own stories. The movement was growing, and with it, so was Darius's resolve. He wasn't just fighting for himself anymore. He was fighting for a future where no one would have to endure what he had. It was a daunting challenge, but Darius Cole was ready to meet it head-on. The system wouldn't change overnight, but change had begun. And that was enough to keep him moving forward. As Darius Cole's story spread far beyond Hillcrest, messages began pouring in from people in other cities. They thanked him for his courage, shared their own experiences with racial profiling, and expressed solidarity. These words of support were a source of strength, reminding Darius why he had taken this stand. But the attention also came with a heavy price. Threats against him became more frequent and aggressive. Anonymous letters filled with hateful vitriol arrived at his office. His phone rang at odd hours, with voices on the other end warning him to stop before it was too late. At home, the tension was palpable. Tessa worked hard to shield their children from the storm that seemed to gather around their family. She remained his steadfast partner, but Darius could see the worry etched into her face. Despite the growing support, there were still many who saw Darius as a disruptor, a threat to the established order. In their eyes, he was stirring up unnecessary conflict in a community that they believed had no real problems. But Darius refused to back down. He had come too far, and there was too much at stake. That morning, Darius prepared for an important meeting with the mayor and other city officials. The agenda was to discuss new policies addressing racial profiling and improving police-community relations. This proposal had been one of Darius's primary demands during the press conference, and the mayor's agreement to hold this dialogue was a small but meaningful victory. He knew it had the potential to lead to something much bigger, a real shift in how Hillcrest and perhaps other towns like it approached law enforcement and racial justice. As Darius finished adjusting his tie, Tessa appeared in the doorway of their bedroom. She leaned against the frame, her expression a mix of pride and concern. "You're becoming quite the public figure," she said with a soft smile, though her eyes betrayed her worry. Darius turned to her, his own expression serious but tender. "It wasn't what I set out to do," he said, "but I guess that's where we are now." Tessa crossed the room and placed a hand on his chest, looking up at him. "I'm proud of you, Darius. I want you to know that. But I'm also scared. All this attention, the threats, I don't want anything to happen to you." Darius covered her hand with his own, squeezing gently. "I know," he said, "and I'm being careful, I promise. But this fight, it's too important. I can't walk away now." Tessa nodded, though the worry didn't leave her face. "Just make sure you're not fighting this alone, okay? Don't carry all of this on your shoulders." Darius kissed her forehead, appreciating her strength and resilience. She had been his anchor through all of this, and he knew he wouldn't have come this far without her. "I won't," he said softly. "I've got you, and I've got the community behind me. We'll get through this." With a final embrace, he grabbed his briefcase and headed out the door, the weight of the day ahead heavy on his mind. The meeting was held at City Hall, a grand building with stone columns towering over the town square. As Darius approached the steps, he saw a group of protesters gathered outside, holding signs that read "Justice for All" and "End Racial Profiling Now." Some of the protesters waved at him, their voices calling out words of encouragement. Darius smiled and waved back, feeling a renewed sense of purpose. Inside, the atmosphere was tense. The mayor, a middle-aged man with thinning hair and a politician's polished demeanor, sat at the head of the table. City officials and police representatives, including Captain Mason, flanked him on either side. The mood in the room was cautious, the participants acutely aware of the sensitivity of the topic at hand. Darius laid out his notes in front of him and took his seat. He knew this wouldn't be an easy conversation. Some of the people in the room didn't want to admit there was a problem. To them, the status quo was fine, and acknowledging systemic issues felt like a personal attack. But Darius was ready. He had come prepared to make his case, not just for himself, but for everyone who had been wronged by a system in desperate need of reform. Darius Cole knew the community was behind him, and he wasn't about to let this opportunity slip through his fingers. As the mayor began the meeting with pleasantries, thanking everyone for attending and acknowledging the incident that had brought them together, his tone felt neutral, almost too polished, as if he were trying to avoid taking a firm stance. Darius listened patiently, waiting for his moment to speak. When the mayor finally opened the floor for discussion, Darius seized it. "Mayor Hawkins, thank you for convening this meeting," Darius began, his voice calm but resolute. "But let's not tiptoe around the issue. What happened to me wasn't just an isolated incident. It was a clear example of racial profiling, and it's something that's been happening to people of color in this town for far too long. We don't need more words. We need real change." The room shifted uncomfortably, but Darius pressed on. "I'm here today because I believe we can do better. We need to implement policies that address the systemic issues within our police department, policies that ensure accountability, prioritize de-escalation, and eliminate racial bias in law enforcement. This isn't just about me, it's about every black man, woman, and child in Hillcrest who deserves to be treated with dignity and respect." A heavy silence fell over the room as Darius's words hung in the air. The mayor's previously neutral smile faded, replaced by a more serious expression. He leaned forward, listening intently, while Captain Mason cleared his throat, clearly uncomfortable. But Darius wasn't finished. "We can't keep pretending that this is just about a few bad officers," Darius continued. "This is about the system that allows those bad officers to thrive. If we don't address that system, we're going to keep seeing these isolated incidents." There were murmurs around the table as Darius laid out a series of proposals: mandatory racial bias training for officers, a civilian oversight board to investigate complaints against the police, and a community task force to rebuild trust between residents and law enforcement. When Darius finished, the room was still. The mayor glanced at his colleagues, clearly weighing his response. After a long pause, Mayor Hawkins finally spoke. "Judge Cole," he began, his tone more serious than before, "you've made some valid points. I agree that we need to address these issues, but implementing these changes will take time. There's a lot of bureaucracy involved, and we have to be realistic about what we can achieve." Darius met the mayor's gaze, unwavering. "I understand that change doesn't happen overnight, Mayor. But if we don't start now, when will we? How many more people have to go through what I did before we take this seriously?" The mayor nodded slowly, clearly considering Darius's words. "You're right," Hawkins admitted. "We do need to start now. I'll see to it that we begin working on these proposals. But I'll need your help, Judge. If we're going to make this work, we'll need to do it together." Darius felt a small glimmer of hope. "You have my full support, Mayor," he replied. "I'm committed to seeing this through." Later that evening, as Darius drove home, he couldn't help but feel a sense of accomplishment. It wasn't a full victory. There was still a long road ahead. But it was progress. The mayor had agreed to take action, and the conversation had finally begun. It was more than Darius could have hoped for just a few weeks ago, and it was a sign that change was starting to take root. When he pulled into his driveway, Darius paused for a moment, staring at the house where his family waited for him. The fight wasn't over. It never really would be. But for the first time in a long while, Darius felt like they were on the right path. As he stepped through the front door, Tessa was there to greet him, her arms wrapping around him in a tight embrace. "How did it go?" she asked softly, her eyes searching his for an answer. Darius exhaled, feeling the weight of the day finally lift, even if just a little. "It went well," he said, his voice steady. "It's not over, but we're making progress." Tessa smiled, her pride and relief shining through. "That's all we can ask for," she whispered. Darius held her close, knowing that while the road ahead would be challenging, they were no longer walking it alone. The community and the possibility of real change was with them. Darius kissed her gently, feeling the warmth of her unwavering support. "We're making the difference together," he replied, his words a quiet promise. As they stood there in the quiet comfort of their home, Darius felt the weight of the journey ahead. He knew it would be filled with challenges, resistance, and moments of doubt, but he also knew he wasn't walking this path alone. He had his family, his rock in the storm. He had his community, ready to stand alongside him in this fight. And most importantly, he had the strength of a cause far greater than himself, a fight for justice, dignity, and equality for all. No matter what came next, Darius Cole was ready. Together, they would face the future and continue the work they had started.